So this video aims to give you a very simplistic overview of the cardiovascular system and the heart and its role and function before we look more specifically at topics relating to each element of the syllabus. So essentially the function of the cardiovascular system has two functions really. One is a delivery system. So it's a network of tubes with a pump which circulates important things for our body to function and for us to perform in terms of sport. And you can see there some of the basic things you'd need to understand is that it delivers oxygen to the working muscles. It delivers us nutrients, which essentially could be the fuel that we use to make energy, so glycogen or glucose or fats or proteins. And it delivers and transports around the body hormones to have an effect on specific target organs. It's also a removal system. So again, you may understand already from GCSE that we need to remove the waste products that we make when we exercise. So carbon dioxide is a waste product or a byproduct of aerobic respiration. So when our muscles work, we make energy, or we need energy to make them work. The more energy we make, the more waste product we have. So carbon dioxide and lactic acid. Lactic acid comes from more anaerobic respiration, so working a bit at a higher intensity, as does heat. We're actually really inefficient at making energy, and about 2/3 of the potential energy we have is lost as heat. And you know from your sport that when you exercise, when your muscles work, you heat up, you increase in temperature. So we need to transport that heat in the blood and get rid of it. So the central functions of the cardiovascular system are for delivery of substances and removal of waste products. So structurally, the cardiovascular system kind of is a double circulation, and some of the diagrams that we'll look at in a moment will show that more visually. We have blood vessels, which are our tubes that transport via blood all the things we talked about in the previous slide. And the two circulations that I'm talking about are the pulmonary and the systemic system. The pulmonary relates to lungs, and the systemic relates to the blood that circulates around our central body system. And in order to circulate blood in these two systems, in these two networks of blood vessels, we need a double pump. So we need our heart to function in terms of ejecting blood and circulating the blood around these two separate circulatory systems. So here's a little bit more of a visual way of looking at the two systems, or the two circulations. The pulmonary, as I suggested, involves blood that circulates from the heart to the lungs and back to the heart. So pulmonary relates to lungs. The systemic system relates to the blood that circulates from the heart to the body and the muscles that we use, and again back to the heart. So make sure you can appreciate that the cardiovascular system has two sort of subsystems or two sub-circulations, pulmonary and systemic. You may understand also that we have two different kinds of blood. We have oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood, and you can see from the sort of colouring that oxygenated blood is typically redder, and certainly on a lot of diagrams comes out as red, and deoxygenated blood is bluer. Now oxygenated blood, as it suggests by the word, is rich with oxygen. It's carrying lots of oxygen, so the hemoglobin that carries oxygen around the body has lots of oxygen attached to it. And once we've used the oxygen in our muscles, the blood returning from the system and eventually making its way up to the lungs is deoxygenated blood. So it has less oxygen in it, less oxygen carried by the hemoglobin. Again, typically arteries carry oxygenated blood. However, there is an exception. The pulmonary artery, which carries blood from the right ventricle up to the lungs, actually, as you can see by this colour, carries deoxygenated blood. So there is one exception to that. I remember it. Arteries or arterial blood carry blood away from the heart. So arteries carry blood away, and veins carry blood towards the heart. Veins, again, typically carry deoxygenated blood, but The pulmonary vein, taking blood from the lungs towards the heart here, as you can see from the colour, is oxygenated. So there is an exception. The pulmonary artery and vein are the exceptions to that rule. Here's again another coloured diagram giving you a little bit more specific description of the sorts of blood vessels. Again, we'll look at those in a specific video. But from the lungs up here, you've got capillaries around all the alveoli in the lungs. This is where gas exchange happens. And then we've got the pulmonary veins taking blood towards the heart. We've got the aorta carrying the oxygenated blood out to the smaller arteries. This is the single big artery that leaves the heart. Smaller arteries then take the blood all over the body. We have smaller arterioles, which are quite important in terms of where the blood goes. And then we have capillaries again surrounding the working tissues, the muscles, because again diffusion happens here. We then have small veins called venules taking blood away from the capillary beds into larger veins and ultimately into the vena cava. There's a superior and an inferior vena cava that enter the right atrium of the heart. We've then got the pulmonary artery carrying the blood back to the lungs, and you can see there's one circulatory system and then a second. You might need to describe the route of blood from one place to another throughout this whole system, so it's quite important that you can name these vessels and name the chambers of the heart that the blood travels through. So here's a description of blood basically from the left ventricle out the aorta, through the arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins, back into the right atrium, right ventricle, up through the pulmonary artery to the lungs. So again, make sure you can describe that, the route of blood through the cardiovascular system. So let's look more specifically at the heart. This is an anatomically correct looking heart. It's not a real heart but a diagram, and you can see it's not heart shaped as in the ones you might draw on Valentine's cards or whatever. It has quite a specific shape, slightly sort of wider at the top and a narrower apex at the bottom. And we're looking at the outside of the heart here, so it's not quite as easy to section and distinguish which chambers are which, but you can see right atrium, left atrium. One important observation is that as I'm looking at it, this would be my right side. This is the right hand side of the diagram. However, the right atrium is actually, doesn't make sense, it's on the opposite side. So you almost have to imagine that you're laid on this diagram, and if you were laid on this diagram face up, this would be your right side. So it's opposites. As you look at it, it's opposite sides, left and right. The atria are the top two chambers, the ventricles are the bottom two chambers. And as you can see, we've got the aortic arch. This is the big artery carrying blood out of the heart, off to the body. And we've got the pulmonary trunk, which is where blood comes into the heart from the lungs and into the heart from the body. You can also see these coronary vessels, which we'll mention in a moment, and these are really important for allowing the heart to work properly. The heart's about fist size, just to the sort of left of your sternum. Your sternum is the breastbone that protects it there. So here you can see much more clearly the coronary arteries, the coronary blood vessels that provide the heart muscle itself with oxygen and with nutrients, because the heart needs oxygen and needs fuel to work. If it doesn't get oxygen, it stops, and we know that people have angina and heart attacks, which is associated with the blockages in these vessels. So if lots of these vessels get blocked, you have quite a serious heart attack. If maybe one branch here, you might have a smaller heart attack. You can also see on this diagram the blue colourings there, which is basically coronary veins. So we have coronary arteries providing the heart with oxygen. We have coronary veins removing some of the waste products. But coronary blood vessels are very important in terms of diseases associated with the heart. Now, as we said, the heart needs oxygen because we have this very, very thick heart muscle. It's cardiac, specialised cardiac tissue. So only found in the wall of the heart, very specialised. It doesn't fatigue unless it doesn't get oxygen, so it can beat obviously very, very regularly for all the years of your life. But you can see again quite a thick middle layer, 3 layers to the heart wall: the endocardium, the inner layer, the big thick myocardium. Associate the word myo with muscle. and the outer epicardium. But this is the important layer, the myocardium. So make sure you understand that myo means muscle. Sorry, yeah, myo means muscle, and cardium is heart, so heart muscle. In particular, you perhaps need to recognise that the heart muscle, which would be this sort of wall here, is different on the left side than it is to the right, because this left ventricle has to eject blood from the heart out the aorta and then distribute it all over the body, upwards and downwards, down to the your toes essentially. And that's quite a big demand for this chamber here. So you can understand that this muscular wall, this myocardium, needs to be quite thick, particularly compared to the right ventricle, which only has to eject blood to the lungs, which are relatively next door. So you must understand that the two sides of the ventricles, or the two walls of the ventricles, would be different thicknesses based on their job. So their structure is based on their function, what they have to do. Here's a slightly more anatomical version of the diagram. So we've got a cross section here. The heart's been sliced, and you can see inside some of the bits and bobs that allow blood to go through from one chamber to another. So let's identify some important things. We've got valves, so the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid or mitral valve. Now this allows one-way flow from the atria, the top two chambers, down into the bottom two chambers. And we'll look at valves on the next slide a little bit more. We've also got valves in the pulmonary artery and the aorta. You can't see the aortic valve, but here's the pulmonary valve. And again, it's a semilunar valve. So these valves allow one-way flow of the blood out of the ventricles through the valves, and they stop it flowing backwards. So we've actually got 4 valves associated with the hearts. Between the two chambers are 2, and at the vessels leaving the heart are 2 more. You can also see these papillary muscles and these chordae tendineae. So here again, the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles. Now these attach to the flaps or the folds of the valves, and they basically allow the blood to come through and then snap the valve shut to stop backflow. So these chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles are all to do with the valves. So here we can see valves a little bit more clearly. In fact, there are 4 valves. The tricuspid is the valve between the right atrium and the right ventricle, and tri means 3, so there are 3 flaps or 3 cusps to this valve. The mitral valve, or the bicuspid valve as it's also known, bi means 2, you can see there are 2 cusps or 2 flaps. These are the 2 valves in the vessels leaving the heart, so from the ventricles going into the 2 blood vessels, the aorta and the pulmonary artery, and you can see that these are similar kind of semilunar valves. So valves allow one-way flow. So here's a summary. Take your time, have a look at these, make sure that you know what these are. Actually, one thing that we didn't mention is the septum. Now the septum is, let me go back a couple of slides here, perhaps to this one. The septum is this central division. We've got oxygenated blood on one side, the left side, we've got deoxygenated blood on the right side. What we don't want is these 2 types of blood mixing. We want to keep them separate, and the septum is the divider between the left and the right side of the heart. Just to give you a slightly more realistic version of what the heart looks like. So these are real hearts, and you can see these are the 2 blood vessels, or multiple blood vessels, entering and leaving the heart chambers. And obviously this is one cut open, so this is cross section, this is the outside of the heart, and you can see it doesn't quite look exactly the same as the diagrams, but what you can see, chordae tendineae here, papillary muscles down there, and this would be a valve chopped open. So you can loosely distinguish the bits. So some characteristics of the heart that you need to appreciate. The myocardium is this muscular wall of the heart chambers is made up of specialized cardiac muscle tissue. There are 3 different types of muscle tissue, and the cardiac muscle tissue is only found in the walls of the heart. It's myogenic, it can contract on its own. It needs coordination, but it has the ability to contract on its own. And of course, you know that it needs oxygen to work, which is absolutely essential. So there's a real heart, which is a bit grim, and That's the overview of the cardiovascular